Okay, this is your Descartes preview, and in particular we are previewing Discourse on Method. Discourse on Method is a six-part essay in pages 5 through 54 in our edition, and it was published in 1637. Now, the first thing I'm going to tell you in order to better understand this essay and be better prepared to read it is make sure you've watched the What is Enlightenment PowerPoint presentation. And there, of course, you'll learn that Descartes was a French philosopher born at the end of the 16th century, and you'll get a better understanding of what his historical and cultural context was. So, Discourse on Methods essentially records a thought experiment on the part of René Descartes. Now, what I mean by thought experiment, it was an experiment in thinking that he was conducting on his own. And what he was trying to do was to find a basis for absolute certainty in an age of increasing doubt and skepticism. Now remember, we talked about the heliocentric theory and other paradigm shifts that were occurring during this time, the end of the 16th century and the 17th century, where the authority of the church and the authority of government and even the authority of our own senses were all coming into question. And so Descartes was looking for a way to achieve some kind of certainty using reason alone, because if you can't trust your senses and you can't trust the government and you can't trust your church, what are you going to rely on to arrive at some kind of certainty about, let's say, what is right and what is wrong? He wanted a kind of mathematical certainty about these things, so he tried to use reason alone. So Discourse on Methods was a tremendously important essay and had great influence in the history of Western culture and Western humanities. And part of its influence is due to at least two of its major contributions. The first is the most famous. It's called the Cogito. Cogito ergo sum. That's Latin for I think, therefore I am. Why was it in Latin? Because Descartes was French, right? And actually he wrote Discourse in French, but it was very quickly, within a few years, translated into Latin, which was the common language of intellectuals. It was the international language of intellectuals. So, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Major contribution that you'll want to look out for. The other is more subtle and a little bit more complicated, but it's the mind-body split. This is a philosophical idea that we find in discourse, which is not perhaps original to Descartes, but you might say that he popularized it, or that modern Western thought traces the mind-body split back to Descartes. And what the mind-body split basically holds is that the mind and the body, the soul and the body, are two entirely separate entities. They are not one and the same. You know, today we kind of think of them often as being the same. The brain is as our personality and our soul, but for Descartes, the mind or the soul was kind of like a driver in the seat of the body, and the body was more like a machine, like a car. So there's a clear distinction between the two of them in discourse. Now, here are some things to look out for as you're doing your reading, and I've sort of divided it into at least one thing for each part of the six-part essay. The first is to pay close attention to Descartes' reasoning, or rather reasons for conducting this thought experiment in the first place. You know, what motivated him to engage in this thought experiment. And then pay close attention to really take note of his four rules for conducting the thought experiment. He systematically set out a set of fairly simple rules, and you should be pretty familiar with them. In addition to the four rules for how to conduct the thought experiment, he also came up with four maxims, different kinds of rules for conducting himself, for how to behave during his thought experiment. Because essentially what Descartes was doing with this thought experiment is he was engaging in radical skepticism, radical doubt, basically imagining that he could trust nothing in the world other than his own sense of reason. And in such a case, how does one decide how to behave? Well, he came up with 4 maxims for conducting himself during this period of prolonged uncertainty. So in part 4, what I'd like you to pay a special attention to is Descartes' proof of the existence of God and the soul. And his way of proving God's existence and the soul's existence is unusual and a little bit complicated. So take your time and look it over and try your best to master his ideas there. Part 5 is perhaps the most difficult part of the book and in some ways the least rewarding because he spends a lot of time on anatomy in that chapter and in particularly discussing blood circulation, and those parts you can kind of skim over. I mean, I want you to read them, but don't struggle over, let's say, the blood circulation descriptions. But what I do want you to pay a special attention to in the second half of part 5 is Descartes' discussion of automata. And by automata, what is meant are basically man-made machines or even robots, though he doesn't call them robots, but he talks about how he could imagine human beings creating a machine that looks and in some ways even behaves very much like a human being. And he speculates about how he might or how he would be able to differentiate between a genuine human being and something that looks and behaves like a human being but is essentially a machine. And this is quite remarkable because you think about this, he's writing this in 1637 and it's basically, you know, a science fiction scenario like something you would see in the movie Blade Runner, which we will actually view later in this semester. So pay close attention to that and try to see if you can follow his argument about how he would make that distinction between man and robot. And then finally in part 6, just be aware that there he's going to be giving his thoughts about his thought experiment, his project, its future, and what he hoped to achieve and what he hopes to achieve for it. Finally, here are just a few small tips for increasing your comprehension of this essay. It's a short essay, relatively speaking, or a short book. It's about 50 pages, but it can be difficult. So first, make use of the tools that are provided to you in your edition, and that includes the endnotes at the back of the book, which will help you understand some of the cultural and scientific contexts for some of the ideas and claims that Descartes is offering. And you might also want to read the introduction in the front of the book. Now, that's not required reading, but it will certainly help you to understand the essay. And I've drawn on the introduction myself in this presentation, so I would recommend it strongly. And finally, give yourself enough time to read this book. It's dense, and some of it is complicated. But I think you'll find if you take the time that there's a lot of meaningful inquiry going on here, and there's a reason that Western thinkers have come back again and again to discourse. So I hope you'll enjoy it, and we'll touch base in a few days.